The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for spending your lunchtime hour with us today. My name is Elise Shadler, and I work for the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program, which is a collaborative program of the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation and University of Vermont Extension. To find more about our program, please visit our website. It's www.vtcommunityforestry.org. Today's webinar presentation is titled Community-Level Tree Risk Management in a Vermont Context, and our presenter this afternoon is Mark Duntemann. Mark presented on this topic at the 2014 Vermont Tree Stewards Conference last October, and we thought it was so relevant and important that it deserved an encore. And so through the miracle of technology, today he's joining us from Glacier National Park to present to all of you. Mark founded Natural Path Urban Forestry Consultants in 1988. The firm's area of expertise is arboricultural maintenance and management policy development, with an emphasis on tree risk assessment and tree risk management. Through this specialization, Mark has been an expert witness in dozens of tree-related injury and fatality cases. This experience informs his understanding of tree risk issues. Mark has a Bachelor's of Science in Forest Resources from the University of Montana and a Master's in Urban Forestry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's an ISA board-certified Master Arborist, an ISA Tree Risk Assessment Qualification Instructor, and a former tree warden for the City of Montpelier. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a couple of logistics. As participants in the webinar, your microphones will be muted during the presentation, but as questions arise, please use the chat box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar side panel and type in those questions, and at the end of the presentation, he'll address the questions in the order in which they came. If you have any technological questions also, you can shoot those in the chat box. I will be monitoring the chat box through the presentation. At the end of the presentation, you will be asked to follow a link to a very short evaluation survey. Please fill this out so that we can continue to improve our future webinars and programming. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on our website, www.vtcommunityforestry.org, as a YouTube video by the beginning of next week if you'd like to pass it along. So with that, I will give the floor to Mark. Thanks again for participating.
Thanks a lot, Elise, and welcome everybody. As Elise said, I discussed this topic at the conference in, I believe, in November, and so certain parts of this are a repeat of that session. But I've also, since then, I've added some elements based on some risk assessment work that we're doing right now. So, and also. The topic here is context for Vermont towns and communities, but some of the additional slides I've added are very much appropriate for anyone, whether it's a consulting arborist, an arborist, or a community around the country, some concepts that are relevant and important for them to be, for all to be understanding and kind of getting a grasp of. So I'm going to start off with just a couple of simple concepts on risk and risk management, and then migrate into how we apply this at a community level. So first off, liability in just real general context defines responsibility. So typically how it's viewed in the United States is that the owner of a tree has a certain liability associated with owning that tree. And there's actually that's not a hard and fast rule. I'll give an example later that the liability can be distributed over multiple parties. And so typically in the U.S. we view liability as a person or entity that has a disadvantage, like managing this site or having these trees, or context of other items, managing a playground, things like that. There's a certain disadvantage because we have the safety of the public that we have to be aware of and manage. So there's two phrases most of you are probably aware of. The first is duty of care, and the second is reasonable care. and so duty of care is typically viewed as a legal obligation that requires an individual or entity to apply reasonable actions when performing tasks that may potentially harm others. And what's important to note here is that first couple words, legal obligation. So duty of care is a legal assignment, and that's for when we're talking about towns and communities. This duty of care is typically assigned at the state or statutory level. So this is something that we typically don't have a lot of control over. It varies from one state to the next. Organizations like the arborist associations, the tree warden groups, the state urban forestry programs can have some role in changing some of those interpretations of legal obligations at the state level. I won't cover that a lot today, but there are some opportunities for changing them and improving on them. The point being is that duty of care is an assignment of legal obligation that we are obligated to follow. The next term is standard of care, and this is where we as managers or tree wardens or arborists have a lot of control over the issue of risk, and that's the degree of care that a reasonable person should exercise in performing the duty of care. And so it's a measurement used in legal matters to assess whether an individual or an entity, such as a town, acted in a reasonable manner. And the thing is that what we found in cases across the country is that the standard of care is really defined by us, and I mean us as managers or maintenance providers of trees. I mean, we're the people that know about trees, the shortfalls of them, but also the positive sides of them, and what is a reasonable measure of care for maintaining trees. And so it's very, very important for everyone here to understand that we collectively as a profession, as managers, control quite a bit of the dialogue under this standard of care. And I'll discuss that a little bit more a little bit later on in the session here. So I have a picture here of myself and a couple of my staff doing some tomography assessments on private property trees in the Chicago area. And so the point being is that while advanced diagnostic systems are available, such as the resistance drilling and tomography, are they reasonable in the context of managing town tree systems? And typically one would say that they're not. This is not, I used to live in the town of Worcester in Vermont, and for the town of Worcester to use the tomography or resistance drilling on a regular basis as part of their operations probably exceeds what would be considered a standard of care for Vermont, even though these systems exist. Both these systems and support systems are client-based driven. We get retained to use these on private property trees, like in the image here, and even on some public trees, say in town greens and things like that, of trees that have cultural or ecologic significance. And so these are very viable tools available for very specific client-based uses, but they are certainly should not be considered part of the standard of care that any community would be using on a regular daily basis. The same could be said for, example, support systems. Support systems are used extensively in Europe and in Asia, and we use them periodically on special projects in the United States. But again, these are two examples of trees in Italy. The one on the left is a cedar of Lebanon that's 140 years old, and you're actually looking at two different systems. The silver metal support system was put in the 70s, and then the green one was one that was just put in recently, and they're removing the silver one. And then the tree on the right is an Italian cypress that's 800 years old, and it's in the courtyard of an old abbey near the Adriatic coast. And you can see that there's, on the left of the tree, that there's, or the right of the tree in the photo, there's support systems for that tree. Both trees are culturally significant for these communities, and they invest the time and money into putting in these systems. And so, again, this level of support systems are very much available. They are available in the United States and used in the United States, but they're not what, unless there's a high cultural or ecologic context for the tree, they would not be considered necessarily a standard of care for normal day-to-day operations. So, but always available when needed. So, standard of care is defined by typically 5 kind of areas: applicable standards that we have, specifications, things like that; best management practices; qualifications. So, what within our industry or profession, what kind of standard do we put on our practitioners to evaluate trees for risk and things like that. Training courses, and then I added, the last couple of days I added this last one, regional consensus. And this goes back to my point that risk is really identified. How it's managed in the standard of care is really defined by the collective profession within the region. The region for Vermont could be in the context of the communities across Vermont, and arboricultural care across Vermont, or New England, for example. But the approach may be very, very different than what is carried out in the Pacific Northwest or the Southwest or in the Midwest. And so there may be a very specific context to how the standard of care is defined within Vermont and New England. And actually, I have a couple of, I think, good examples on this. Now, what's kind of difficult for all of us when we're talking about trees and risk in urban settings, and I use urban loosely here, and I'm talking about populated areas, is that we're trying to manage natural systems, biological systems that grow, mature, provide benefits, and then become over-mature and senesce and begin to deteriorate. But that whole process may take decades, if not generations, for completion. So we're managing natural systems in a developed environment. So there's site considerations like construction, roads, sidewalks that alter soils, hydrology, wind patterns. All those things are site conditions of the that affect this natural system, and in most cases they affect them negatively. And then, of course, the last part is that there's a human presence, and so we're trying to manage risk with this understanding of all 3 of these areas. We're managing a natural system in a developed environment with a human presence. And in the Vermont context, we're talking about towns and villages, but we're also talking about, for the private sector, as an example, you have people living in residential, home that has trees around it. And so while it's a rural setting, it's still, these 3 bullet points still are very appropriate. Just the construction of the house, the use around the house, the human presence, places, identifies a risk. Now, something that is, and I'll touch on a few times over the rest of this talk, is that when we're managing risk, we're really trying to weigh the community benefits that trees provide against the risk to achieve a balance. So what we're trying to do is optimize the benefits, the plethora of benefits that we get from trees, from aesthetic to environmental to economic to social, while minimizing risk. On the left in this slide, you see a 44, I think it's a 44-inch diameter swamp white oak, and it's actually in front of a public works facility. and has very low risk associated with it because very few people go in this area. But it's a remnant of pre-European settlement vegetation in the Chicago area. It has a 120-foot canopy. It's a beautiful specimen of that species, and so it's providing benefits to that community along a couple different categories: aesthetics, and environmental, and so on. But the tree on the right, this tree was out in front of my house actually up until last year, and it's a Norway maple, and you can see both pictures are that Norway maple. At the base of that Norway maple, it's completely girdled, roots girdling probably 90% of the base of that tree. And then if you look at the kind of profile of the crown of that tree, that this tree is in significant decline. The crown is it's over senesced and falling, essentially falling apart, declining, dead wood, things like that. And so the risk associated with this tree, while it's a relatively small tree, the risk of it is increasing with time. But also think about what's its contribution to the community. The contribution is also, well, it's declining at a substantial rate. The aesthetics of it, its environmental contribution to the community is quite diminished. At the same time, the risk of it failing and possibly hurting someone increases. And so hopefully you can see that there is this balance of making decisions on the benefits that a tree provides against the risks that same tree may have. The next couple slides are ones I've added since the talk in November, and they're very, very important for us to understand because the litigation cases that I've mostly been involved with in the up through today are that in litigation, the risk of a hazard tree, quote unquote hazard tree, is looked at in absolute terms. The tree we're looking at in litigation was a hazard or not a hazard, and that's really an unreasonable kind of perception of risk. Risk is about uncertainty. And so, unfortunately, our discussions on tree risk are dominated by images of tree part failures that cause harm. And that drives a lot of litigation in this country. However, we all know that most failures do not result in harm or damage. You're looking at an image of I think most of us would agree, is a pretty large silver maple that fell over on a street. And this is, I believe the tree was about 24 inches in diameter. It fell over, and while this is a significant sized tree, besides the cost of cleanup, it did no other damage, even though it's on a busy road in a residential neighborhood. And this is kind of an extreme view, but the reality is that most branches or tree parts that fail do not cause harm. And that's an important concept to understand when we're, as managers, trying to grasp with the issues of managing tree risk. So risk associated with trees are broken. This is based on the newer ISA track information. It says risk associated with trees depends on the likelihood of two events happening. And it's critical you understand that both events have to occur in order for some negative consequence to be realized. The first is the likelihood of a tree part failure. Okay, we can all understand that. What's the likelihood or probability that a whole tree or part of a tree fails? Okay, that's one likelihood or probability of an event happening. The second likelihood is if that part fails, does it strike a target, either causing harm, damaging property, or impeding services like taking down utility lines, things like that. But that, again, is also a probability. So, and then the third kind of element to this is that if a part falls and if it strikes a target, what are the consequences? And those, we all can understand that the consequences can be very, very different depending on the size of the branch and how high up in the tree it is and what type of target, things like that. So what's interesting is that within arboriculture and tree management and communities, we focus on the likelihood, the biomechanics of failure. So within our profession, we focus heavily on the likelihood of a tree part failure. And that's good, but everyone must understand that that's only one part of determining risk. And then in litigation, attorneys have a tendency to focus on the second one, the likelihood of striking a target. And oddly, we're in this position because we have a hard time discussing both of these points, is that we're put in this predicament in a lot of litigation cases that every part that fails can strike a target. But my question is, every part that fails, does it strike a target? And the answer to that is no. And in significant numbers, they do not strike a target. But in litigation, it's almost viewed as a one-to-one relationship. Every part can strike a target, and it's a discussion that needs further elaboration within our profession. So the new tree risk qualification from ISA, I stuck this risk matrix in. You'll see very quickly that the risk matrix here identifies on the left the likelihood of tree part failure plus striking a target. It goes from unlikely to very likely. Then across the top is the consequence of failure. And what this matrix tries to capture is that out of the 16 possible combinations, half of them identify a low risk potential. And so what the matrix tries to identify is give a reasonable interpretation of what's actually happening out there, that most tree parts that fail don't cause harm or do negligible harm. There's only one of the 16 matrices, the extreme one. In order to have an extreme situation, the likelihood of failure needs to be high, the likelihood of impacting a target has to be high, and the consequences have to be severe. And so to have all three of those things happen is rare. And my experiences in the work I do, in the litigation work, it kind of validates that that understanding that most of the events that happen are rare, that are extreme in nature. Now, there's a slide that I've added again since the November talk, and it's a key one that ties in with this idea of the likelihood of an event happening, what our thresholds for risk are. I'm going to use in auto insurance as a real quick example. Okay, you have, most of us know, that we would drive a car, you have car insurance, and the premium that you pay is a function of information that's been collected about the likelihood of an event happening. So a 21-year-old male that has 4 or 5 speeding tickets will be paying a higher premium than, say, someone in their 50s or 60s that has a long and a good driving record. The auto insurance industry has decades of information where they can come to some definitive kind of conclusion on what the risk is associated with giving insurance to a 21-year-old or a 50-year-old, depending on what their history is. And so this historic record identifies whether or not there's a problem. And so then you address the problem based on that historic information. And so it's important for us to understand is that what investment is required to reduce risk, and does it actually reduce risk? So I use this idea of whether it's real or perceived risk. And what you're seeing here is a map of Cook County Forest Preserve, 70,000 acres, and they have about 8,000 acres abut public use areas, whether within their sites like picnic grounds, trails, things like that, but also the roads that border these sites. And we did an evaluation of how much it would cost to do a simple assessment of all the trees that were within falling distance of these public use areas on this site, and mitigate any issues we found. And we found that doing a walkthrough of this 8,000 woodland acres near public use areas would cost the district in tens of millions of dollars a year, both on the inspection and the mitigation. Now, the Forest Preserve has a record of 2 incidences in the last 10 years where a branch has fallen and hurt somebody. Now, I asked people attending today is that if you invested, say, $20 or $30 million to do inspections on a 70,000 acre woodland site that's managed as a natural area, how much of a reduction should the Forest Preserve see from 2 events every 10 years? Do you think it would go down substantially, go up substantially, or stay the same? And I would argue that they could invest $20, $30 million into an inspection program and mitigate everything, but then in the next 10 years they would probably experience 1, 2, or 3 events still occurring. And so that event, infusion of tens of millions of dollars would not, in my view, substantially reduce the number of events occurred. So this is based on their current inspection and maintenance program having 2 events every 10 years. And so hopefully people can understand that you have to balance, is the investment, an attorney can say, well, if you go out and prune every single tree on this site, you're going to reduce risk. It's easy to say you're going to reduce risk, but does it actually reduce risk? And I would argue in this instance it does not. Because the number of events are so statistically are insignificant to manage. So we use this historic information to help develop thresholds for taking action. So most risks that we're aware of can be quantified, and I use this very simple example here of, risk is the likelihood of an event occurring. And when we're talking about trees, we're talking about negative consequences. And most of us know that in quantification, as an example, there's a simple example, is choosing heads on a single toss of a fair coin, you have a 50% chance of getting heads and a 50% chance to getting tails. And that's easily understood by most people, and it can be quantified. Over time, you'll average about half of the time you'll get heads, half the time you'll get tails. But what's the likelihood of choosing heads on a single toss of a double-headed coin? You have a 100% chance of getting heads on a single toss of a double-headed coin. And if you're the person that knows that it's a double-headed coin and you choose heads, you have, again, a 100% chance of getting the correct answer every single time. And the reverse also occurs, that choosing tails on a single toss of a double-headed coin will always give you what? A 0 chance of getting the right answer. And what seems like a silly little exercise is the importance of it is that if you're investing money in this toss of a coin, like gambling on what the outcomes are going to be, information will help drive whether you have a positive or a negative experience with this coin toss. And so that's kind of the point I want to say here, is that we're dealing with biological features, and so risk is about uncertainty. And so we gain more control over risk exposure with information. And we don't have maybe complete control over it, but the more information we have, the more control that we can place on our actions and policies to reduce risk exposure. This is a very important thing for all of us to understand. And so how do we get information? When we're managing trees, everything from tree inventories, resource assessments, an evaluation of regional policies are examples of how any community in Vermont or really anywhere can start to get a basis for gathering the critical information to make good long-term risk reduction strategies. So what does a tree inventory do for us? It identifies positive and negative elements of the population. Inventory should be developed at a scale that is appropriate, meaning too much information makes it unwieldy. Not enough information may not provide the information you need in order to manage your resource well. We participated in an inventory of advising on an inventory in Bogota, Colombia a few years ago, and they collected 87 pieces of information on every single tree. You can imagine, how unwieldy something like that was. And so, a simple inventory that gives you location information, species, a diameter, maintenance needs, immediate maintenance needs, and structural defects that should be of concern. So, we're talking maybe 10 to a dozen pieces of information can help in developing, for towns, develop long-term risk strategies. Resource assessment defines the community's capabilities and limits. How large is staffing? What is staff capabilities? Their training in risk assessments or arboricultural practices, safely removing trees, things like that. What kind of equipment do you have for meeting some of the demands and needs? Budget is critical. Most risk fluctuates between communities and towns based on available budget. So a town X may have 200 trees they have to remove and have a healthy budget. Town Y may have 200 trees to remove and not a very good budget, and so may have to stretch the removals over a longer period of time. But I would argue that as long as the town identifies the issue and develops a strategy based on their resources and moves to take those, remove the trees in a timely fashion that's appropriate for their resources, they can, and I would argue, would have a reasonable program, even though both towns may remove them at different rates. And then operational program, what other aspects of the town or community's program, from highway maintenance and management, building maintenance and management, things like that, what are the context of all the other operational programs that the town has to manage as part of their kind of duty to the community and the residents. So regional policies, we look at things that what are the statutory duties assigned by to Vermont communities by the state legislature. And frankly, I don't know what some of those are. I'll give an example though. In Illinois, strictly very much defines, the state legislature defines that communities have a duty to maintain the safety of the public way. So that's the sidewalks and roads. And so most towns in Illinois view that duty to not only the trees on their property that they manage, but also trees on private property that may fall into the public right-of-way. And so that duty is very clearly defined by Illinois state statutes. Another example is the state of Illinois defines what is a co-owned tree. So a tree that may straddle a property line, how is that defined? And so you can understand that co-owned tree, whether it's defined or not, may define a homeowner or a town's liability that that homeowner or even the town may not even understand. So those are two examples of possible statutory duty that are assigned at the state level. And then what is the standard of care in Vermont? And I mentioned this earlier, is that the standard of care is really defined by the profession. And I mean the profession of arborists, consultants, tree wardens, community volunteers even, the state agencies, all collectively by our practices define what the standard of care is in the state. So those are examples of regional policies. Now, in the past, within arboriculture, some of the instruments we've used for identifying risk in trees have, in my view, overemphasized large parts on trees. And I want everyone to look, this is that same Norway maple in front of my house. Take a look at that tree, and I want to ask you, how many different parts on this tree can fail? And the answer is every single one, okay, from the whole tree, so the trunk failure or root failure, but every single one of those branches has a potential to fail. And if we look at it, what's the likelihood of striking a target? And that's very much a function of the branches on the left have a higher likelihood, if they failed, to striking a pedestrian if they're walking on the sidewalk, and vice versa. There's the branches more likely than not, if they failed over the street, would hit a car if there happened to be a car present. If I go to this last question, right now, looking at this picture, if we're thinking about humans, just as in this moment in time, say this picture was taken just right now, is this tree a hazard? And I would argue that it's not, because the presence of a person either driving a car or walking on the sidewalk is not there. So right at this moment, the tree has a very low risk associated with it. But if I start walking down this sidewalk and now is underneath that tree, it now is what? The risk associated with it has increased because I am now present. But in the past, and even today, we put trees in this context of identifying targets. If there's a sidewalk by, that means that there's typically there's a high risk of striking a target. Well, that's not necessarily true. Is that for a long period of time by this tree, there's actually a low risk of striking a person, and then periodically, when there's a pedestrian walking or a car going by, the risk goes up. And it's those peaks that we focus on when we really should be trying to understand that over the duration of the life of the tree, most of the time there is not a target present, even though the tree has visibly some very significant issues associated with it. So it's important that we get a better grasp of the actual risk associated with this tree. And the risk is not constant. And so understanding that higher use roads, higher use sidewalks by schools and downtowns, things like that, have a higher potential of causing harm because if this tree was in those areas, there's just a greater likelihood of a person being present. One last comment on this slide is that I mentioned earlier that we have a tendency to overemphasize large parts. On any average day, what size part is going to fall out of this tree on any average day over the next year? And there's a greater likelihood of one of those 5 or 6 inch branches falling out of the tree than the whole tree failing. So in fact, there's actually a greater risk associated with the smaller branches than there is for the whole tree failing. And that is something that is lost in some of our discussions about risk. Not de-emphasizing, but kind of with the overemphasizing of large parts, missing the point that the small parts actually potentially have a higher risk associated with them. So I want the last few slides are just going to discuss the enhancing our understanding of risk. And those last couple slides were kind of an introduction to that. It's important to understand that risk is managed over time. So you may go out and identify a tree that needs immediate care taken, either removed or branches taken out of it, because you see something that is structurally not good, or there's a lot of people present and it has to be mitigated. That is very much part of managing risk. But change over time, the number of incidences that happen in a community, the number of insurance claims, things like that, that is how you quantify or gauge whether your risk program is working. And so risk is managed over time by implementing policies that just reduce risk based on maintenance cycles, inspections, and things like that. So I'm going to use a really quick example from Worcester again on how towns can identify some issues and how to contend with them. So in the state of Vermont, the Agency of Transportation has identified 4 classes of road, and in the town of Worcester we have I believe there's only 3 classes identified. Class 1 is State Route 12, goes through the center of the town. Then there's some Class 2 that are typically paved roads, but they're managed by the town. And then Class 3 are gravel or dirt roads that are also managed by the town, and you can see the miles, the miles associated with each one here. So each one we can understand has different density of use. They have different managers. So the state manages the State Route 12, and then the town manages the orange and green roads, the Class 2 and 3 roads. So they are there. Is that using available information, we can stratify the road priorities within the town. And I mentioned already, these are broken down by class, but also whether they're paved and also volume of use. So I'm going to look at just Class 1 roads, Route 12. This is in the village of Worcester. This last November I took this picture of a sugar maple that is dead. And it has a lot going on. I think it's visually apparent that it's part of the asymmetry takes it into the road. There's a lot of decay and deadwood on the tree, and my understanding is that the state would have the responsibility of removing this tree. But who locally may have a better understanding of that tree and the use of that road is possibly the town. So the town may do the inspection or the kind of the identification of the issue, but then inform the state to mitigate the tree. And so it's the town and the state on these roads that are working in partnership. The town is the eyes, at least partially the eyes of maintaining a safe thoroughfare through the town. But the town certainly would not be expected to remove that tree because it's within the state road system right-of-way. So the inspection is done by one person or entity, and the mitigation is done by another. And the state certainly does inspections along these roads. That's not to discount that. But locally, while responsibility may not extend to identifying that tree, working in partnership will reduce the risk along this road. Okay. Now we're going to look at Duger Road, or Gould Hill Road, and this is the road I used to live on when I lived in Vermont. And this is a Class 3 road. It's dirt or gravel. Has very low use. There's probably 8 or 9 residences on this property. But we start looking closer. There's a lot of problematic trees on this road. But the difference between this and Route 12 is that the likelihood of a tree failing may be moderate to high, but the likelihood of striking a target is certainly a lot smaller or lower than on the state route. And so numerous towns in this kind of situation may look at this. If we went out there and did an evaluation on any one of these 3 trees, we may evaluate and go, well, that tree has to get removed. Well, you can see pretty quickly that you'd be removing half the trees along that road. is this goes back to the point of investing. What is the investment of funds really going to reduce risk on this road? And I would argue that in most cases it wouldn't. It would certainly remove a lot of trees, but the likelihood of an event happening, the second element of the risk identification, is actually very, very low. There are some things I'll point out. Portions of the road have limited trees present, yet may still have a high failure risk trees. These are dead American elm that are on Gould Hill Road, but very close to the intersection at the Route 12. And so it's at an intersection where there's greater likelihood of traffic, people pulling off the main road to go to their residence, and there's more traffic there. Even though you can see, compared to the woodland area that we looked at a minute ago, it's very sparse. There's very few trees of significance along this portion of the road. But the town should be somewhat concerned about those. Now I'm going to show one last example for Gould Hill Road. I'm going to show this is an image, a Google Map image from a fatality case in Ohio from a few years ago. The tree on the right that you see leaning, it's a 22-inch diameter red oak that failed on this steep slope that was real friable, erodible soil. It fell into the road late one night, and a woman driving home from, actually it was Christmas, dinner with her in-laws, hit the red oak and died as a consequence of the accident. And this is an example of site conditions that we should be aware of at times, and how we can use information to maybe reduce risk on certain portions of roads within the towns in Vermont. So the issue here was that the tree fell into the road, and what you see up ahead of you is that where this photo is taken is that you're in a swale in the road. And so about 250 feet further is the crest. And if I did turn around 180 degrees and look the other direction, you'd see the exact same image. A crest in the road about 250 feet back. And what I put on the left-hand side there is that this road was wet, and the woman was driving about 55 miles an hour. That was the speed limit on the road. And so see what the stopping distances are there. On a wet road at night, she came over the crest of the road, and the oak was lying in the road. So she didn't have the stopping distance to stop in time before hitting the tree. And the significance of this is that there's parts of the roads. I'm going back to Gould Hill Road now. And what you're seeing is, what do you see on the right there? That's a crest in the road. And while this is a lower mile per hour road, I think it's like 30 or 35 miles an hour road, someone coming over that crest in the road, if a tree, where I took the picture here, if a tree fell there, there's a greater likelihood of that same kind of incident happening, someone coming over the crest quickly and not being able to stop in time. And so this is, on this whole road, this is the only crest that really occurs. So on a 2 or 3 mile, 4 mile stretch of road, this is just, there's a higher risk associated with it just because of the crest of the road. On the left is a sharp, almost 90-degree turn on the same road, and your line of sight is very, very poor as you approach the corner there. And so that's another kind of blind spot where, if there's mature, sugar maple that are in very lousy shape, you can come around that corner and there could be a dead or tree across the road and possibly not have enough time to stop. And so there's these kind of very simple little places where you identify critical risk points that are very specific spots on your roads. I'm not talking the whole road system. I'm talking about picking spots that have these kind of features that kind of increase the likelihood of an event happening. What's interesting on that curve on the left is I actually got in a car accident there coming down the hill where someone coming up the hill was in the right lane. And so we hit head on there, completely destroying my car, and theirs too. But what kind of information is available to identify that spot? You know, there was a police report about that incident, and I'm sure that that's a well-known corner in Worcester for accidents. And so just looking at county or town police records or state records of accidents in your town, identify possibly in the more rural roads, you know, intersections or places where there is a higher risk of a tree failure happening where the driver may not see the tree. And so those police reports actually identify this corner, and it ties in actually potentially as useful information for town members to identify risk issues. So the last couple of slides here are just, you know, how does a community or town manage the liability associated with trees? And collecting data on events is really, really important. I just gave an example of one. You know, where do things happen? Do events actually happen in town? If they don't, then, you know, we're managing risk as best we can with very little information about, you know, potential events. And so a record of past events is a good indicator of, do we even have a problem? And how rigorous our program has to be maybe modified if there is a problem. City of Chicago has, as an example, has a significant number of insurance claims or damage claims because of like branch failures and things like that. And I would say that most of those claims are just from parked cars that have like an American elm branch fall on the car. But those claims are an indicator. You know, I have no idea what they pay out every year, but that number, the number of incidences and the amount they pay out, helps define a threshold. Are we paying out too much? Are there too many incidences? And if we can collectively or individually say, yeah, I think there's too many incidences, then that's a key identifier that something in your program should possibly change to reduce the number of incidences happening. It's a very important concept for all of us to understand in order to quantify or at least identify whether there is even a risk issue or liability issue there. So defining a reasonable program, what's reasonable for your community, enhancing staff skill sets, meaning training staff to be able to identify risk issues and then mitigating them, making appropriate recommendations on mitigating. I say this all the time. It doesn't matter that it could be Los Angeles or Worcester or Putnamville in Vermont or in the town of Worcester, is that we rely on our town staff and the arborists that we hire to be at the forefront. The safety of the general public is, in fact, we rely on our staff to make those determinations to make for a safer environment. Yet we see time and time again across the country where the people we rely on to do the assessments are not given the tools to do the assessment. And this is a very important element of their work. So we're always encouraging enhancing knowledge and experience for staff. Developing short and long-term policies, and that could be everything from developing like this, the road prioritization and inspection intervals for higher and lower use roads. Implementing some form of cyclic inspection program. If you look at the Worcester roads there on the right, you know, maybe the state route needs to be visually inspected once a year, or the class 3 roads maybe every 3 years. But you can see pretty quickly that you can set up an inspection interval that can fit into your day-to-day operations that doesn't overtax the town's resources, both in staffing and equipment. So some other short and long-term policies for all towns to think about are refining the mechanics of getting a tree removed. I can't tell you how many injury or fatality cases we've been involved with where a tree has been marked for removal. There's actually an X on the tree, and then 9 months later the tree falls over and either kills someone or causes harm. So the risk assessment, it went to a certain point and successfully, marked this tree for removal, but then the mechanics of getting the tree out failed, resulting in some catastrophic accidents happening. So what I mean by mechanics is that, if I identify a tree, that tree on State Route 12 in Worcester, if you identify that tree, who do you call? And how do you follow up to make sure that the tree is removed if it's not your responsibility? If it's the town's responsibility, how quickly, based on your assessment of the risk associated with the tree, how quickly does the town act to move that tree out of the population? Attention to species-specific issues. I'll keep this simple, but emerald ash borer as an example. If you have dead ash trees, what we found in the Chicago area, where I reside right now, is that a dead ash tree, a tree may be dead for about a year, and within 6 months to 12 months, the tree starts falling apart. But what starts falling apart are like the 2-inch branches, and they keep very close to the understory, under the crown of the tree. And so a 2-inch branch low on the crown typically does not have a high risk associated with it. But as time progresses and the dead tree is left there, especially in high-use areas, you can imagine that larger and larger parts are going to start falling out of the tree. So the risk associated with it increases. Site characteristics to consider. They're an impediment to good tree health and structure. This is more about placing, when you're planting trees, to place them, to give them aerial space so that they're not suppressed by adjacent trees, which increases dead wood, things like that. Migrating negative, I should really change the wording on this, but migrating negative elements out of the population. This, as an example, is if you identify certain group of trees that have high use areas, and there's sugar maples with very large cavities in them, or silver maple with a lot of dead wood in them, it's migrating those trees out of the population is what I mean by reduce risk over time. Because they're not all going to fall down tomorrow. But if you can engage a policy that moves them out of the population over a period of time, that is a defensible strategy for reducing risk. And then migrating from reactive to proactive. Reactive is that a storm comes in and you react to the consequences of that storm, as an example. But proactive is just the simple procedure of implementing an inspection program that works within the confines of the town's resources. It doesn't mean every single tree has to be inspected, every year, but you decide on, collectively decide on that, high-use roads over low-use roads. What kind of interval works for you. And then evaluate data that defines problem areas. That's everything from car accident reports to just insurance claims, things like that. A number of complaints that you may get from the residents of the town for certain trees or certain areas. Those are all things that help define whether even a problem exists. So.
Mark, we are. Oh, there you are.
That's actually. I don't even know what time.
It's just about one. I didn't want to stop you because you were doing so well. So I do want to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if you can hang out for just a couple minutes, if people do have specific questions.
Oh yeah, I have plenty of time.
Great. So to everyone, thank you for listening. Mark, it was so great to hear this again, and I'm sure everyone took a lot from it. If anyone that is in the webinar wants to stick around and ask some questions through the chat box, we'll try to answer those the best we can. I do want to just remind everyone that our next month's webinar is going to be on Thursday, February 26th, the same time, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it's going to be an overview of tree ordinances, tree policies, and the Vermont Tree Warden statutes, and it'll be presented by Danielle Fitzko, who is the program coordinator of the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. And if you want to sign up to get reminders about our webinars and our other programs, you can find that sign-up information on our website at www.vtcommunityforestry.org. So let's see if any questions come in. Other than that, we'll just thank everyone again for coming. So Mark,
yeah, Elise, I want to state, you know, if, you're going to post this, right? And
yeah, it'll be on the website probably by Monday. It'll be on as a YouTube video.
I do encourage anyone, you know, the email's there, and I'll actually, if I get some pointed questions from people later, I'll forward those back to Danielle and Elise. But I encourage people, if you have any questions about any of the topics covered, I know it's a lot of information, do not hesitate to email, ask me a question. So.
Okay, so we got a couple of questions here. Let's see. So here's a comment. This is not really a question, but all of that information sounds like a heck of a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of a volunteer tree warden. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, the bulk of the talk is really to. I have to say that we've done over 40, 45 fatality and injury cases, and what's frustrating about those cases is that it's driven by litigation and the attorney, and it's a portion of this discussion, if not a good portion of it, is about that. Risk is about uncertainty, and so a lot of the language, a lot of the slides in there are about how we cannot fall into this trap of describing risk as this absolute, okay? And that's a huge trap in litigation. And believe me, there's tons of consulting arborists that fall into that trap in litigation. And essentially, they're not advocates, but they end up just kind of repeating, in my view, misstatements of risk. And so you take a town like, a volunteer tree warden. I was the volunteer tree warden in Worcester, and we developed that inspection thing as part of that volunteer approach. It's really being cognizant of increasing when you're going down the road, that you see something of concern, that you act on it, and that's really at the very the town level, that's really, really critical. And so I would say that most people listening in here, from Vermont at least, is that you're doing the job that you're assigned to do. Increase your own skill set, okay? Always challenge yourself on what you're being told, including from me, and increase your ability to do assessments. And the second part is there an issue? And that doesn't take a lot of time, and you may find that the issues are non-existent. We talk about risk. We see all these significant cases of people getting hurt or killed, but is that the reality for your town? And so I just really ask the volunteers to keep it in perspective. This is not, I don't present this to scare anyone about the issues. If anything, it should, the uncertainty of it is actually supposed to be reassuring, that we don't deal in absolutes, and be comfortable with that, because we can't micromanage every single branch on every single tree in your town. And we're told that we should do that, but that's, in my view, a false assumption. So. Great,
thanks. Okay, we got a couple more questions came in. So here's one. A tree that is marked for removal but has not yet been removed falls and causes injury and death. In your experience, is it a greater liability since it is marked and thus it was known that it was a known risk since it wasn't removed?
No, I'm any risk manager, regardless of what type of risk they're managing, will tell you that, what information is important, okay? And it's really about, marking the tree is, that's a tool for identifying, what trees to take out of there. But, whether or not the tree is marked at one level doesn't matter at a certain level, because if it's a high-risk tree that you think should come out, whether it's marked or not, you have this understanding that it should come out. The problem becomes in all these cases, again, keep this in context, we don't mark a tree and then it falls over 30 minutes later. Maybe sometimes it does, but the reality is that, we're not walking down Gould Hill Road with a hard hat on, because trees and branches are falling constantly, and you have to keep this in perspective. Or we'll all go crazy if we don't. It's if you mark a tree for removal, the importance is that you professionally have identified that tree as an issue based on how risky or how bad the tree is. How fast do you move on it? And you may find a tree that the town has to act on today, but more than likely, most of the trees that you mark for removal are not. You have context of time that is allowed. A week, 10 days, 30 days out is starting to get a little long there. But if you identify something that you think is a risk and marking it, act on it. We have done cases where a tree's been marked and it fell over in a short amount of time, and I think successfully argued that the tree was part of a process. Okay, what's reasonable? That you're managing all these trees on all these roads and you don't have the resources to mark a tree most of the time and then remove it immediately. The courts understand who you're trying to convince. You're not trying to convince an attorney. You're trying to convince a judge or a jury that you have this reasonable process. But you have to define what's reasonable. Now, if you mark a tree and a year later it's not gone, then that's a problem. But so you have to kind of define that. But that's a failure of policy rather than a failure of marking the tree. You've got other problems if a tree fails. That's been marked for quite a long time. So you went through the process and successfully identified it. And again, I point out in the slides, it's the mechanics of getting the thing out in a reasonable manner. But an attorney doesn't define reasonable. You define what's reasonable. I know that's kind of a lot.
No, that's good.
If you have more questions on that, just email me and I'll give you more detail on it. But.
Great. Okay, so here's a question about documentation. Do you think it's a good idea for all tree evaluations done by certified arborists to have a copy in writing on record?
Yeah, personally for the business we do it. Unfortunately, the record, it's kind of a two-sided sword. You have for some lawsuits we've been involved with against towns, is that the records, when I'm talking from a municipal level, is that the records were identified that, for example, a town went and looked at the tree 6 times after 6 complaints were, but they did nothing about the tree. And so the record keeping actually, went against the town. But I would argue that that's also a policy failure. Someone actually went out and inspected it, but then the follow-through failed, appropriate assessment, things like that. When we do evaluations, we always do everything in writing. And that's not necessarily to protect us. We want to make sure that the information that we're transferring to a client is clear and understandable. And I can tell a client to remove it, or a town to remove a tree. I can't make them remove the tree. They still own it. They make a judgment based on whatever, or they may just forget. The towns I have a strong relationship with, or the residents I have a strong relationship, I do follow-up. Even though I have no obligation to a certain level, if I think a town or a resident should act on something based on what I reported to them, and they haven't, then I do follow up and try to get them to kind of see the critical nature of what I recommended to them. So.
Okay, well, I'm gonna do one more. I have 2 questions from one individual, and I'll pose one, and maybe I'll let him send you an email about the other one because we are running over. But do you have experience with trees within the clear zone on roads? Cutting trees back tends to increase speed. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, there's actually, and I understand there were some issues in Vermont after those, the storms recently of like clearing back, and there's just there's more and more research. One, I think, well, never mind what I think on that, but it's clearing back does. There's enough research out there that shows that it increases traffic, and I'd also argue that if you do a lot of abrupt road clearing back to to where the right of way is, that what you've essentially done is possibly increase the potential of tree failures, because now you've opened up the trees that were in the interior a little bit. Now you've opened them up to edge effect, and so what in the short term a town may think they're reducing risk. That's questionable whether that's actually occurring. The second is that speeds do increase, and the third is that you may actually increase the number of trees failing doing that type of clearing. So.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark, for your expertise and for your presentation again. If anyone else does have questions, just shoot Mark an email. His slide is still up there, or you can contact us at Urban and Community Forestry. All right, so we're going to close out, but thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you all next month.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.